exhorting visitors to come forward and be saved, or come forward and be baptized in Jesus right now, or come forward and receive the Holy Spirit right now. In fact, on the contrary, the priest warns you not to come forward unless you are a Catholic in good standing. And you think of how Jesus, said, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no life in you. I mean, that pulled him in. And when everyone left, he turned to his faithful congregation and he said, "Do you want to leave too?" So he was a master of marketing, obviously. When G.K. Chesterton decided he wanted to become Catholic, well, it was something that he kept deciding to do. And it was a long process. In fact, it was a very slow and deliberate conversion. In fact, I could think of fewer conversions slower and more deliberate than his. 20 years before being received into the Catholic Church, he was defending the Catholic Church, and he said, the church will always be attacked because it's Catholic. It will always be defended because it's Catholic. And 10 years before his conversion, he wrote, "If every man lived 1,000 years, every man would either be a nihilistic atheist or a member of the Catholic creed." That was 10 years before his conversion. And it was about that time when he first approached Father O'Connor, his friend and mentor that he'd known for since about 1904, and started talking to him about the idea of becoming Catholic. That was still 10 years before he actually did. And it was during that next decade he was continuing to explain to people why the Catholic Church had endured for 2,000 years and how the church was wiser than we are. But it wasn't until he walked into a church in Italy on his way back from the Holy Land on Easter Sunday, a church in Brindisi. It was just the feast of St. Lawrence of Brindisi the other day, so I was thinking of this. He walked up and he walked in and saw a statue of the Virgin Mary holding the baby Jesus, and he looked up, and that's when he made the decision. When I go back to England, I'm going to enter the Catholic Church. And it was still 2 more years before he did. Why the delay? Well, there's 2 classic reasons. No, there's one classic reason, and I think there's another reason. The classic reason given, which I totally agree with, he wasn't ready to do anything without his wife. He and Francis shared everything. He could not imagine not sharing the most important thing in his life with his wife, Francis, his faith. And yet, she was probably even more agitated than he was that he hadn't become Catholic, because she knew it was so heavily on his mind. And she had contacted Father O'Connor, who she actually confided in even more than Gilbert did as a spiritual counselor, and said, you've got to talk to Gilbert. He's just not at peace right now. And yet that was a very difficult thing to do, to make that step without her. But Father O'Connor began the instruction. He was also instructed in part by Monsignor Ronald Knox in one of those amazingly backward things where Ronald Knox had become a Catholic because of reading G.K. Chesterton. And now he was a priest, and he was giving formation to his own mentor. And the day he was received was just a very low-key ceremony. 100 years ago on July 30th, so 2 days from now will be the 100th anniversary of his reception, in just a temporary chapel in Beaconsfield, England. It was a a lean-to with a corrugated tin roof attached to a hotel next to the railroad station in Beaconsfield, where in this little chapel, Father O'Connor and Dom Ignatius Rice received him into the Catholic Church. And it was bittersweet in that both he and Francis were waiting for this day. It was really the fulfillment of both their wishes. She wanted him to become Catholic, and yet they knew at that moment something separated them, and that there was both joy and tears at that ceremony. And there was, it's a story. It ends happily because Francis did become Catholic 4 years later. What was the other reason for the delay? Well, I think this was more surprising, and I think it's even more troubling. He reveals it in his book on conversion. He says there's something, in fact, that he says it shows that it was something he experienced. He says that when a man's thinking about becoming Catholic, ordinary anti-Catholic propaganda is not an obstacle. That is not what keeps the potential convert out of the church. The convert is scarcely ever frightened of the Protestant picture of Catholicism, but he is sometimes frightened of the Catholic picture of Catholicism. For the convert's sake, it should be remembered that one foolish word from the inside does far more harm than 100,000 foolish words from the outside. So if there's one startling lesson to learn from one of the most famous converts of the 20th century, it's that what kept him out of the Catholic Church so long was Catholics. In joining the Catholic Church, Chesterton found, like all converts have found from St. Paul to Cardinal Newman, this amazing freedom, this amazing liberty, especially an intellectual liberty. Conversion, Chesterton says, calls on a man to stretch his mind as a man awakening from sleep may stretch his arms and legs. He even says it's a dizzying liberty. It's utterly different from what the world thinks it is. Tell a Catholic convert that he's lost his liberty and he will laugh. Now, what's interesting is that the convert is almost always having to defend his faith after his conversion. And Chesterton, is typical of the convert having that experience. He's always defending his reasons for becoming Catholic, because the convert really always feels like a new Catholic. This is the 100th anniversary of Chesterton's conversion. This year also marks the 25th anniversary of my conversion. And thank you. And I still feel like a new Catholic. I feel like I just became Catholic the other day. And it's still completely exciting for me to defend the faith, to declare that I'm a Catholic, and I still feel like everyone else has been a Catholic longer than I have. And it's a great privilege to reach non-Catholics and play a role with the help of the Holy Spirit in, promoting their conversions. But most of my audience continues to exist, mostly be Catholics, and I find that a lot of my work is to startle them awake, because to get them to see the faith that they have, but to see it as if they're seeing it for the first time. Chesterton says there's a great value in preaching to the converted or preaching to the choir, because he finds that they don't know their own faith. But when Catholics do discover their faith, they get very excited. They get very excited when they realize what they have. And that's why, at that same crucial moment we were talking about earlier, when Jesus said to Peter, "Do you want to leave?" Peter had to make a decision. And every Catholic has to have that conversation with Christ. And they have to say, hopefully, with St. Peter, well, where else would we go? You have the words of eternal life. We believe, we know that you are the Holy One of God. And they have to stop being the kind of Catholics that keep away converts. They have to start being the ones that start welcoming them in. When I told you about that very unceremonious ceremony that in which Chesterton was received in this corrugated tin roof, one of the letters written to him was asking about his conversion and asking him, are you just trying to, embrace this romantic vision of medievalism and big, beautiful, old ritualist churches? And, what is it? Why did you really become Catholic? The letter was written by a man named Bertram Hyde. And Chesterton says, well, I ought to say first, saving the grace of God, my own conversion to Catholicism was entirely rational and certainly not at all ritualistic. I was received in a tin shed at the back of a railway hotel. I accepted it because it did afford conviction to my analytical mind. But people can see the ritual and are seldom allowed to hear of the philosophy. About the ritual, I think the truest thing was said by Yeats, the poet, certainly not a Catholic or even a Christian, that ceremony goes with innocence. Children are not ashamed of dressing up, nor great poets at great periods like Petrarch wore the laurel. Our world does something of what Wells says, because our world is as nervous and as irritable as Wells himself. But I think the children and the poets are more permanent. And 3 years later, Bertram Hyde was received into the Catholic Church. What else happened in 1922? James Joyce wrote Ulysses. T.S. Eliot wrote The Wasteland. Two works considered landmark and groundbreaking, or maybe we should say landmark breaking, the way trespassing is, or some other violation of something that should be respected. I mean, what the two works have in common is that they're both unreadable. What the two authors have in common, interestingly enough, is that they are both just on the edge of the Catholic Church. Joyce, the Irishman, lifelong Catholic, but outside of the church, alienated from the church, a little bit bitter against the church, and certainly not comfortable at all with it. And then T.S. Eliot, the expatriate American who becomes the high church Anglican. In fact, it was about Eliot's faith that the Jesuit Jacques Maritain uttered his one and only witticism. He said Eliot could not become Catholic because he used all his powers of conversion becoming English. Way to go, Jacques. And Joyce, like most lapsed Catholics, avoided saying anything about Chesterton. And Eliot, like most high Anglicans, expressed his great admiration for Chesterton, but didn't want to quite talk about the Catholic stuff, that unpleasantness there. And Chesterton, however, writes about both those other authors. He sums up Joyce as someone who wrote for Joyce, and Eliot as expressing melancholy and disillusionment in a style almost maddening to the point of unendurance. Chesterton says, all great poets do not drop hints or let observations fall. They lift them and hold them aloft as the keystone of a strong arch thrusts up the stones, defying the law of gravity and the devil and all his angels. The words of strong poetry are packed as tight and as solid as the stones of the arch. The lines of a good sonnet are like the bridges of sound crossing across the abyss of silence. The boast of the bridges is that you could march armies across them, that a man could rest his weight on every word. That's what poetry is supposed to be. Tomorrow we'll give you, hopefully, a taste of some good poetry with the troubadours, if the other four don't screw up. So 1922 gave us this revolutionary literature of James Joyce and T.S. Eliot, and really, in a way, epitomizes the direction of the 20th century with the great intellects using their great powers and just coming up with nothing. And then continuing their decline throughout the rest of the century. And T.S. Eliot and Joyce, so revolutionary, they're about to be canceled completely. They're going to be a footnote. They were the biggest thing there was for a long time, and no one's going to be reading them pretty soon at all. Chesterton was going the opposite direction. In 1922, G.K. Chesterton does the opposite thing that the rest of the intellectual world is doing. He enters the Catholic Church. And this giant intellect, they said, well, how could this happen? And he said, being a Catholic doesn't mean leaving off thinking. It means learning how to think. And so what has been the ripple effect of Chesterton's conversion? Well, how many here became Catholic because they read G.K. Chesterton? Up, Glenn. Okay, all right, good. It's fantastic. If you are not on my list already, come see me. I want to make sure you get onto the list. How many here are just converts without necessarily Chesterton as a... Look at that. Look at that. It's his conversion paved the way for many other conversions in the 20th century. I think we should also talk about the man whose conversion he was largely responsible for, even though he didn't become Catholic, C.S. Lewis. You're going to be hearing more about how Chesterton had an influence on C.S. Lewis during the conference later on, during the podcast of the Pints with Chesterton. Is that what the name of the podcast is? Pints with Chesterton? Yeah. I just want to briefly say that, Chesterton explains his own conversion to Christianity in his book Orthodoxy and in a lot of his other writing. And, in this condensed version, which is from the book My Name is Lazarus, in that essay that I put together from many different essays, I never realized that the great common sense of Christian creed until the anti-Christian writers pointed it out to me. I was not defending any particular theological points. I was merely defending plain old human morals. I was defending responsibility, which is sometimes called the question of free will. It was not that I began by believing in supernormal things. It was that the unbelievers began by disbelieving even in normal things. It was the secularists who drove me to theological ethics, by themselves destroying any sane or rational possibility of secular ethics. It was the scientific determinist who told me at the top of his voice that I could not be responsible at all. And I was rather like being treated as a responsible being, not as a... I rather like being treated as a responsible being and not as a lunatic let out for the day. I began to look around for some spiritual asylum that was not merely a lunatic asylum. And on that day, in short, I escaped from an error, which still entangles many better men than myself. There was still a notion that an agnostic can be content with knowledge about worldly things and never settle the questions about otherworldly things. But it's not true. The questions of the skeptic strike direct at the heart of human life. They disturb this world quite apart from the other world. And it's exactly common sense that they disturb most. There could not be a better example than this determinist shouting to a mob of millions of men that no men ought to be blamed for anything because it was all heredity or environment. Well, logically, that would stop a man from saying thank you to somebody for passing the mustard. For how could he be praised for passing the mustard if he could not be blamed for not passing the mustard? Chesterton's great intellect, understanding that if we don't have free will, we've got nothing. And if all of our actions are determined by nature or nurture, if any of them rob us of our personal responsibility, there's no business even arguing about it anymore. And of course, it was C.S. Lewis who understood how great Chesterton's arguments were, which brought him to the Christian faith. And of course, that was one ripple. And another ripple was that so many people who have read C.S. Lewis have gone on to read Chesterton. I was one of those people. Because I read Chesterton and became Catholic, I had the strange privilege of doing a show on EWTN about G.K. Chesterton. And because a lot of people watched that show, that led to a great revival of interest in Chesterton. And his books started coming back into print. The Chesterton Society started making really a great impact. And a lot of those people who watched that show became Catholics or became more Catholic. But here's another ripple. Because I became Catholic, my wife became Catholic too. That is, she returned to the faith that she had been raised and baptized and confirmed it, but it was a faith that she never really lived until we both embraced it. And we had the great pleasure and blessing of getting married again in the Catholic Church, having our marriage validated by a priest. And because we became Catholic, for some strange reason, we had 4 more children. But because we had those children, we had to figure out where we were going to send them to high school. And because we weren't happy with any of the choices we had for high schools, we started our own high school. And because we started the first Chesterton Academy, there are now over 50 other Chesterton Academies all around them. So that's a ripple effect of Chesterton's conversion that's going to be felt for years to come. Chesterton says the age is always converted by the saint who contradicts it the most. Remember, he became Catholic in 1922 when the rest of the intellectual world was going completely in the opposite direction. He contradicted the world as much as possible by becoming Catholic at that moment. And there's just maybe one other point I'd like to make. What time is it here? Do I have to stop, or I can? 7:30? Well, I can keep going a little bit longer. Whereas, if I were Chris Check, I wouldn't ask what time it was. I would just keep right going. I would just right going. The man who does not understand the clock. It's going to be a great talk, this one on Christopher Columbus coming up. But bring something that will help you endure it, because it's going to be long. Because the trip across the Atlantic Ocean was long, and you're going to find out everything about that trip. So 33 days. Albert, there was supposed to be a picture up there. Do you have it? let's have that picture up there, because that's not it. It's coming. That one. You've all seen that one, maybe. That's called the conversation piece. Painted in the 1930s. It hangs in the somewhere in a in an overflow room at the National Portrait Gallery because it's not out in the public for some reason. Although the pencil sketch of that entire painting hangs in Queen Elizabeth's private parlor. Isn't that cool? And everyone knows who Chesterton is, most everyone knows Hilaire Belloc sitting across from him. Most people don't know who the third gentleman is. It's Maurice Baring, sometimes pronounced Morris Baring. I don't know how he pronounced it. I never heard him say it. But he was as close a friend to Chesterton as he was as Belloc was. And unlike, of course, when Chesterton saw the famous painting, when it was completed, he looked at it, he pointed to Baring, and he said, Baring. And then he pointed to Belloc, and he said, overbearing. And then he pointed to himself and said, past Baring. But unlike Belloc, Baring was also a convert. He had been received into the church in 1909, more than a decade before Chesterton. And I'm sure that his conversion had a deep effect on Chesterton. And when he heard the news that Chesterton had been received into the church, he was just overjoyed. And I should say that when Chesterton was received into the church, it was big news, except for the fact that it wasn't, because the two priests who received him into the church, Father O'Connor and Dom Ignatius Wright, as they walked out of the church, said, "Let's not tell anybody. Let's see how long it takes everyone to find out." And it took about 3 weeks, and that's when the news hit the press. And there were two great reactions to his conversion. There were those who thought he already was Catholic, and then there were those who thought he would never become Catholic. And two people who were as surprised as anybody. Well, Belloc was really surprised because he'd never thought it would happen. He never thought that Chesterton would become Catholic. But when Baring heard the news, he wrote a letter to Chesterton, and he wrote, "Dear Gilbert, when I wrote to you the other day, I was still cramped by the possibility of the news not being true, although I knew it was true. I felt it was true at once. Curiously enough, I felt that it had happened before I saw the news in the newspaper. I felt that your ship had arrived at its port. But the more I felt this, the more unwilling I was to say anything before I heard the news from a source other than the newspapers. Nothing for years has given me so much joy. I've hardly ever entered a church without putting up a candle to Our Lady or to St. Joseph or St. Anthony for you. And both this year and last year in Lent, I made a novena for you. I know of many other people, better people far than I, who did the same. Many masses were said for you, and prayers all over England and Scotland in centers of holiness. I will show you someday a letter from some nuns on the subject. A great friend of mine, one of the greatest saints I've ever known, Sister Mary Annunciation of the convent orphanage, always used to pray for you. She alas died last year." And he talks about entering through the narrow door where one must bend one's head into the internal space and freedom of the eternal and universal Catholic Church. Space and freedom. That was what I expected on being received, and that was what I have been most conscious of ever since. It's the exact opposite of what the ordinary conceives to be the case. There's one more passage I'd like to read from this letter, but I first want to mention two things. Mother Angelica, God bless her and rest her, she said that every convert converts because someone is praying for them. And I found, when I was ready to become a Catholic, in fact, I attended the last Chesterton conference in Milwaukee. And it was in the summer of '97. And there was a priest there. He said, Dale, I was going to ask you what religion you are. And I said, well, Father, I'm Baptist, but I've made the decision that I'm going to become Catholic this year. He says, oh, good. I've been praying for your conversion. And I barely knew this man. But he'd been following my writing in the Gilbert publication, in the Midwest Chesterton News publication. And I think about that. Maurice Baring had been praying for Chesterton's conversion. But then he tells him there are whole convents full of nuns praying for his conversion. I mean, they knew that he was going to be a power for the Catholic Church, but they also knew that he was a big mountain to be moved. And there was that kind of prayer going on for his conversion. And then, of course, that what he says about the freedom and the space of entering the Catholic Church. Belloc says that to him, and Chesterton, obviously, who read this letter, writes the same way about how you enter with your head bowed, and you find inside the church is larger than the outside of the church. It is the place of space and freedom. In fact, eternity is inside the church, and the outside place is narrow and cramped outside the church. And then in his conclusion to his letter, he says, well, all I have to say, Gilbert, is what I think I've already said to you, that I was received into the church on the eve of Candlemas, 1909, and it is perhaps the only act in my life which I'm quite certain I have never regretted. Every day I live, the church seems to me more and more wonderful, the sacraments more and more solemn and sustaining, the voice of the church, her liturgy, her rules, her discipline, her ritual, her decisions in matter of faith and morals, more and more excellent and profoundly wise and true and right, and her children stamped with something that those outside her are without. And there I have found truth and reality, and everything outside her is to me compared with her as dust and shadow. Once more, God bless you and Frances. Please give her my love. In my prayers for you, I have always added her name. I might have a conclusion to my talk in these papers somewhere. Nope. And thank you.